Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to our summit wrap up and closing keynote. We made it to the end of our inaugural Changemakers Summit, and we hope that the panels and events of the last 2 days gave you some new insights and ideas to fuel your spirit and work beyond the summit. My name is Gloria Coe. I serve as Senior Director for Alumni Career Engagement at UCLA Alumni Affairs. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and my physical description, I'm wearing a blue blazer, Asian American, have brown curly hair. My background is our racial equity at work, Zoom background. So I'll turn over to Kathy, who's on our board of directors, for some remarks.
Thank you, Gloria. On behalf of the Board of Directors of the UCLA Alumni Association, I wanted to extend a big Bruin thank you to all our speakers, panelists, and volunteers. This summit would not have been possible without their willingness to be vulnerable and lead with courage and honesty. Also, I would like to say a special shout out to our Bruin professionals, Asian Pacific alumni, American Indian, Lambda, and Latino alumni who hosted mixers and events with our summit this week.
Thanks, Kathy. And so we hope you learned lots of new things through all of our different programs, but I'm really excited to introduce our closing keynote speaker, D'Artagnan Scorza, your Alumni Association president, currently serving as the inaugural executive director of racial equity for Los Angeles County, DART, lovingly known as DART. His work has centered on building leaders who fight for equity in communities and for schools. He founded and was the executive director of the Social Justice Learning Institute and served the Inglewood Unified School District as president of the Board of Education. Thank you for being here, Dart, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Gloria. And thank you, Kathy, for that wonderful welcome, and Paco for your leadership. You know, this Changemakers Summit was born out of a belief that we're in a moment in our history, in our society, where we're reckoning with issues related to race, and looking for ways and strategies to advance racial justice. And so I just want to thank all of you that have been participating over the past 2 days in this summit. I want to thank our board members who are here and present with us today, our network leaders, many of you as alums, our friends and family of Bruins that are also present, because I think in many ways it signifies not only our willingness to change and improve conditions in our society, but a desire to be open to learning things anew, right? To helping to make UCLA and our entire Bruin family successful, and to position us for such great work in the future and moving forward, so we can serve all of our alumni for years to come. So again, I'm D'Artagnan Scorza. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. I'm the president of your UCLA Alumni Association, and I'm here to offer hopefully a bit of advice as well. And you can sort of take that advice if you think it'll work for you or not, frankly. I mean, I think in many ways, what we're going to talk about is just but one sort of tool, one sort of set of strategies, and hopefully frame an approach to doing this work in our communities. Look, for those of you who don't know my story, I grew up in South LA, and both in Watson, Inglewood, and I faced a number of challenges in my own childhood growing up. Living in a neighborhood, an area of concentrated disadvantage. I will tell you what that means is growing up in concentrated disadvantage is that my community was segregated. It was redlined, right? It was the 10 freeway was built here in Los Angeles County that created essentially what we now call a South Central Los Angeles. It between the 10 and the 110 freeways, it cordoned off a lot of Black folks sort of east of the 110 and the Watts area, who began to move westward in the 70s, which is and 80s, which is when my family eventually ended up in Inglewood as well. So what I learned growing up was that I had a lot of really amazing things in my family. My aunt and I were talking recently, and she said, we may have been a poor family, but we were proud, right? We were a poor but proud group. We in our neighborhood, when I was 7 years old and my family couldn't afford a birthday cake, the neighbors across the street baked me a cake and gave me $7, which in the 1980s, that was a lot of money. You could get a Tootsie Roll for like 2 pennies back then, or a penny back then, right? So in the 80s, that was beautiful, right? Moms down the corner, moms would, she was the church moms of the block. She was an elder in the community, an older Black woman. She would do what's called these Kool-Aid icy cups for us in her deep freezer on the porch, and we go pay 25 cents to get an icy for them. And sometimes when it was just hot, she'd give it to us in the neighborhood, right? We had all these beautiful things that were happening in our neighborhood. I can drive, we can ride around the corner on my little GT skateboard and go miles away, and we knew that we had family or friends to look out for us. So even though I grew up in these conditions, I still grew up with some amazing people in my life who helped to make sure that I could eventually make it to a place like UCLA, which is why one of the reasons why I'm a Bruin. Because even though I may have faced issues like being homeless as a child growing up when my grandmother lost a house and my mom, who was struggling to make ends meet, couldn't afford the rent as well, even though I may have faced issues, with other challenges in my family and my life, there were still amazing people in our community who lifted me up. So by the time I made it to UCLA and eventually returned to work on my Ph.D., I was deeply committed to coming back to my community, returning to my community to help improve conditions, which led to the founding of my organization. Because I remembered all the amazing people who invested in me, and I wanted to be a returnee. I wanted to come back to invest in another generation that was coming up who may have been facing some of the challenges I faced as a child. But I will tell you, what brought me back to my community was the death of my cousin. And he was shot and killed in Watts on one of the streets that my family had grown up on. And I remember just how disheartening, how heart-wrenching that experience was. He was supposed to come and live with me. I had just gotten back from Iraq, and in 2005, in 2005, I just come back, and about 2 weeks before he was going to come and live with me, he was shot and killed. And that sort of really drove me. That sort of pain inspired me to want to do something about the material conditions that young Black men and communities of color were facing at the time. And I launched my organization and began that work some 15 years ago. And I will tell you that it was exhausting, absolutely exhausting. Not only sort of doing the work in the organization, but recognizing that it wasn't just my cousin, JB. It was also the students that I was working with who were facing challenges. I had a young man who when he was in middle school, had heard loud sounds just outside a door. And he ran out of the door and he tripped over something. And he was trying to figure out what was going on. He was looking for his brother. He goes outside, he trips over something, and come to find out that it was his brother lying on the ground. And I remember when he shared that story, it sort of had us all in tears because we could at some point all relate to that type of loss. And in doing the work that I did with those young folk, and finding ways to heal and adopting sort of a healing justice framework, i.e., looking for strategies to improve outcomes in our lives, I came to build resilience, but I also came to understand and to sort of carry with me those experiences on a regular basis. So when I came to the county and was asked to sort of help lead this work for the county, I realized that it was going to be really important for me to take care of my own emotional health. That to take that experience that I was, that I gained in the community, the experience of improving housing outcomes and conditions for folk, the experience of making sure that we were dealing with issues like the Inglewood oil fields or the lack of parks and healthy space and green space and building gardens in our community and making sure that young folk could get to college and exit the juvenile justice system, making sure that people could eat and live healthy lives. When I knew I came to the county to do that work, and it was going to scale that work up for the 10.1 million residents we have at a $36+ billion institution, that I had to be prepared to both recognize what it was going to take to do that work, but also recognize what it was going to take to care for myself. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about sort of and frame why it's even important to even do this work. Now I start with that story because I want you to sort of know that this for me comes from a deeply personal place. It comes from a place of experience. And for some of us who are doing this work, that may not be our experience, and it doesn't have to be. But I know for each and every single one of us that are driven to do this work, we're driven because we want to achieve justice, right? We're driven because we want to see good things happen for people in our society. We're driven because we all can't suffer the suffering, right? And that takes a lot out of us, right? Many of us are doing this work, sometimes care so much for other people. We see these injustices and we want to rectify them, but yet not always recognize how that affects us. So today we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how that may show up in our lives. But before we get there, let's talk about why this work itself is important in the first place. So this is a summit focused on racial equity at work. But in order for you to know why this summit is even important, we got to talk about the role of race in our society. Because we may hear this, you may see these numbers, see this data, right? Lower life expectancy rates for African American, Native American people, lower educational attainment and achievement rates here in LA County for Latino and Latina men and women, greater mortality rates for Asian American, African American, and Latino families in Los Angeles County during COVID, lower educational attainment rates for other communities, right? I think all of these things show up and we talk about these disparities, but we don't quite articulate where they come from. Even with COVID, right? We talk about COVID sort of exacerbating the challenges we're facing. If you see at the bottom left of my slide here, there are a lot of families, a lot of communities of color that can no longer afford their rents. We have this huge looming sort of crisis at hand. And fortunately, our federal government has stepped up to help people catch up on their rent and to help make landlords whole because economies were shut down, businesses were shut down. So the government stepped in, but that doesn't take away the stress and the challenges that a lot of our communities are facing. And again, when you look at the death rates and mortality rates, the loss that's occurred throughout our entire county, throughout our region, throughout our society, right? We can see the impact upon communities of color, the rise in food insecurity, the loss in income, the loss in housing, right? The rise in homelessness. All of these things are affecting and impacting our communities in dynamic and tremendous ways. But where did it come from? So I share with you, and I offer to you this chart. Now, you know, we don't often talk about slavery in our conversations, right? But let's just contextualize why we see the conditions we do. Because in the founding of this country, there was one group of people who exploited another group of people for their labor, right? And they did so violently, and they constructed this concept of race, which is a social construct which was intended to morally justify a repugnant institution. You cannot morally justify enslaving another group of people. And so this social construct that we call race was divined and designed, right, to try and reconcile an immoral concept. It is not a real concept upon which we can even argue exists. This theoretical construct was used to build wealth, power, and privilege for an entire population of people at the expense of another population. And when this country sort of decided to do away with that institution, the institution of slavery, it transitioned into a new institution to maintain the economic prosperity of that same group of people and to find ways to exploit, exclude, or control that other group of people. And they've done that, right? That has been happening, not just with African Americans, but we see that with Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander populations. We've seen that with our Native American populations who were also enslaved. And when those institutions, when Jim Crow and the Supreme Court began to challenge the role of segregation in our society, new institutions emerged, new strategies emerged to maintain in our policies and our practices and our systems a social and a racial hierarchy that made it very difficult for that group of people who were originally exploited to make progress throughout our society. And so we continue to see the vestiges through our policies, our laws, our practices, through our procedures, through the decision-making apparatus that are in place at the federal, at the state, at the regional, at the local level, in our universities and our institutions. We continue to see these vestiges through these policies, through these systems, through these institutions, both publicly and privately, leading to what we now term as sort of a combination of structural and institutional forms of racism. It is the practice, right, that has led us to where we are today. To see African-American students who are not being admitted or accepted to UCLA, right, in the 2006s and 2007s, who are highly qualified, being accepted to all these tier 1 universities around the country, not be admitted. That was a vestige of our admissions policy that was born out of SB1 and SB2, passed in 1994 under Ward Connerly, which eventually led to Proposition 209. Right? So these policies, these laws continue to create the racial inequities we see that I talked to you about and shared with you earlier on that initial slide, demonstrating a snapshot of disparities. And the truth is, folks, when one group of people are not able to thrive economically, they're not able to pay for healthy food, they're not able to pay for housing, they're not able to pay for their children's ability to go to college. They're not able to afford a home. They're not able to pay for rent when their wages are stagnating and they're not able to afford just the basics they need because there's not a prevailing wage to help them survive and do well, much like my own mom, much like my own family who struggled to make ends meet. So why do we even talk about race? We talk about it because it denotes a relationship of power, right? It's about people who are in positions of power, your managers, your senior managers, your university leaders who can make decisions. It's about the way in which they utilize their power to make decisions, either in ways that limit the self-development and self-determination of people, or in ways that may create structural and material constraints. Who's writing that exam? What band is that person in? Who's reaching out to the people in their family to offer them the opportunity to apply for this position? Who's picking up the phone to network with their business partners, friends, to get their child a position, right? The way in which we utilize our social networks to advance or create opportunities for our families and our children over those of others in our society, right? Racism is, and I use this term, it's like sugar and water, right? It's pervasive, it's woven, you can drink it, it's like you see it there, right? You don't always see it there, but you know it's there because you can taste it. It's found in most aspects of our life, and we don't always realize when we're experiencing it. Let's talk about this here in LA. We're a liberal blue community, right? We're a diverse society here in Los Angeles, but did you know that Los Angeles has the largest number of Native Americans in an urban community? Did you know that here in LA County, during the 50s, more than 160,000 Native Americans were repatriated to our communities here in LA? Did you know that they were promised in places like not just LA, but Denver and Chicago, but they were promised that they would be given homes, or they can be provided support for getting homes, getting jobs, getting access to schools, and none of that materialized. And their lands were taken. So that today, here in Los Angeles, we have the largest Native American urban population. Did you know that in 1863, California state legislature passed a law that Asians, defined at the time as Chinese, Mongolian, and Indian, and others, could not testify in courts against white, and it made them vulnerable to abuse and injustice and put them beyond the reach of the law? Did you know that a race riot erupted right here in downtown Los Angeles on October 24th in 1871, when a mob consisting of approximately 500 white people entered Chinatown and attacked, robbed, and murdered Chinese residents? They hanged at least 17 to 20 Chinese immigrants in the course of that riot. And this is what we now know to be present day Los Angeles Street, between the historical monument and Union Station. In fact, Mexican repatriation, which took place in the 20s and 30s, and eventually with the Braceros program in the 50s and 60s, took thousands of Mexican American citizens who were predominantly US citizens and forcibly sent them to Mexico. Even government officials like social workers were used to coerce Mexican Americans to leave for Mexico, suggesting that if they apply for public assistance, they would do better in Mexico. Can you imagine why folk today do not trust government officials when they talk about completing the census or getting them resources? Because government officials, including social workers here in LA County, were used to help deport citizens of the United States. Even for African Americans, displacement occurred because of the massive freeway construction that took place in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which made it easier for white families to move from suburbs and establish new exclusive communities, which disproportionately displaced Black and brown families through the use of eminent domain. When communities of color didn't have the capital and resources to sort of protest freeway construction, but white families did, one of the reasons why you see the curves in our freeways the way you do with the 10 freeway, for example, is because white families would often lead what were called freeway revolts, and that would result in campaigns to change the contours of these freeways around places like Beverly Hills and Laurel Canyon. This is our own story here in Los Angeles. And I share this with you because you're going to have your own story from whatever city you might be in. And it's important for you to find out that story. So to be actively anti-racist means that we must identify and proactively go after the systems, organizational structures, policies, and practices, as well as the attitudes that we hold and inhabit, so that power and resources are redistributed equitably in our communities. Ultimately, what we're trying to aim for is a society and a world that is held to a higher standard. A world where no one's race will determine whether or not they bear the burdens or benefits of society more than the other. A world where you're not more likely to be unemployed because you're Black, or more likely to have heart disease or obesity because you're Asian American or Latino or Latina or Pacific Islander, or no more likely to be shot by the police because you are a male or a female, right? That's what racial equity is ultimately about. That's what we're talking about, folks. We're talking about achieving a time and a point in our society where we are all able to benefit and do well and thrive, to be able to live a good life, to not have to grow up in homelessness, to not have to grow up living in these challenges, but instead we can have our families together and live good lives together and do well. What often happens is this idea, and this comes from John Powell's work at the Haas Institute up north at Berkeley, is that we typically other people on the basis of their characteristics, their religion or their age or their ethnic group or their sexual orientation or their race or their class or their gender, and we create marginality on the basis of that characteristic. And we utilize those human differences to do so. And what eventually, and in some ways this happens because we're sort of built as humans to, utilize our bias to other people, right? And what often happens is we sort of learn things as children growing up. We then, enact it through our behaviors, and we have these thoughts that we don't even realize exist. We have self-talk that occurs. And we are typically brought up in our society to believe that everyone should be treated equally without a recognition of the differences that people face, without a recognition of the starting place that folk may be beginning from. So when we're thinking about all of that, that brings us to what it means for you all who are doing work. I don't want to get into like all the toolkits and all the things that you're probably doing in your workplace, because I know that you've had those conversations leading up to today's session. But what I do want to talk about is, now that we sort of understand why it's important to do this work, now that we understand why race plays a factor in our work, now that we understand what this means in communities and why it's critical that we be anti-racist, let's talk about what it means when you actually begin to take that action. And in some cases, what happens when you take on those actions in spaces much like the ones that I shared with you earlier with my young folk, or in your workplace. Often there's transference, emotional transference, in some cases vicarious trauma, where you are caring so much about this work that over time, it can lead to effects upon your physical and your psychological or spiritual well-being. Sometimes we see this pain, we see the knee on the neck of George Floyd, and we are collectively traumatized by that, and we carry it with us. And it builds in us. Or maybe you are a Black person or a woman in your workplace, and you are treated as an object. And that micro or microaggression continues to build up over time. Or maybe you watch television and you see look, I'm gonna tell y'all, I could not watch the Derek Chauvin trial. I did not watch a day of it. I could not do it. It was too much for me. I completely tuned it out. And that was one thing I needed to do to make sure that I maintain my emotional and mental health, because I was really frustrated and angry. And I didn't want to see the videos. And I don't want to see another video. And I don't want that to happen for there to even be another video. But because it continues to happen, many of us carry these experiences emotionally with us over time. So if, for example, you are doing this work, you have this care for this, for our communities, for our society, you want to improve conditions, you're often sort of carrying with you this set of characteristics that cause you to be more likely to transfer these emotional experiences and carry these emotional experiences in your day-to-day work and life. You're more likely to have the sort of physical and psychological stress associated with doing this work than people who don't care, frankly. It's more likely to affect your relationships, because if you live in an environment, if you're in a work environment where people are culturally intolerant, or if you're in a professional setting, whether or not your organization supports your work or not, or even if in your own life, maybe your family needs your support, maybe you are a mother and you're providing care for your children, and then you go to work and you're trying to engage in these efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion, you might find yourself feeling exhausted. And that context continues to exacerbate the likelihood that you're receiving the likelihood that you're maybe facing either vicarious trauma or dealing with emotional transference associated with that work, and feeling stressed and feeling exhausted as a result. So some of the ways that you can deal with this is by identifying coping strategies. Lazarus and Folkman identified two types of coping, and that included problem-focused coping, which is where you're trying to solve the stress that you're dealing with by changing that event or that circumstance, and emotion-focused coping, which is when you're trying to change your personal reaction, your interpretation of that event. So for those of us who are doing this work, we're often like so deeply enmeshed, we care so much about it, that sometimes it is okay to give yourself the freedom to be mindful, to rest, to play, to back up and say, you know what, not today. I'm shutting that off. I'm not going to listen to that text. I'm not going to get that notification. I'm going to put my phone down at this time. I'm going to not answer my boss's call today. I'm going to tend to my kids' needs. I'm going to go camping. I'm going to go to the beach. I'm going to take a day. I'm going to spend some time for myself. I'm not going to be on back-to-back Zoom calls all day. I'm going to turn off my camera because I don't feel like engaging in the emotional labor associated with having to smile in front of all my colleagues today, because I am really exhausted. And your emotional labor is not free. Furthermore, one of the other things that you can think about is how we can continue to make meaning of the work that we're doing. Identify ways to build meaning, right? Because Martin Seligman will argue that happiness is not just in sort of your and sort of the pleasures that you get physically from eating or from engaging in an intimate relationship. Happiness comes from meaning making. It comes from the purpose that we develop in society, and this sense of sort of building meaning around the work that you're doing or finding ongoing meaning can help to reinvigorate you throughout that work, and bringing others into that meaning making experience as well, creating shared meaning. Helping to build emotional support around shared meaning, being able to call upon your colleague or your coworker or your friend because they can relate to or understand what you're going through, and relying upon them for social support is a powerful way to do this work. And then finally, thinking about it in the long term, what sort of, what balance are you achieving? What connection to others are you making, especially given COVID? Often social workers are ones as well who are having to deal with this on a regular basis. Given this time, healthcare workers are having to deal with this, right, through COVID. Creating a sense of awareness and balancing your life and connection to others and finding ways to build social support is going to be critical for your ongoing success. For those of you who are like, I'm not really feeling that, I don't really have those stressors or traumas, even if that's not your experience, I still want to call upon you to be anti-racist in the space, to find ways to support those who are doing this work. If you're not the quote unquote diversity, equity, and inclusion person, or the access and justice person, or the racial equity person, you can still help support that workplace by being anti-racist. Meaning you're not off the hook either. Reflect on your own racial identity. Understand the context of the work that that person's engaged in. That it's not easy work, that it is emotionally draining work, but that it is meaningful work that needs to be done. Understand how your system, your institution affects other people's racial identities. When they say, this is how I feel because of my positionality in society, don't just blow them off. Don't just ignore them, right? Challenge your own beliefs. Hear people out. Understand what they are saying when they're explaining how difficult this work is to do. Examine your own internalized beliefs and or forms of racism that may, or homophobia that may exist in your life, right? Challenge your own identity. You can also increase your capacity and be able to do that by learning about structural racism. Maybe many of you didn't know about LA County's story or LA's story. You can learn about Jans's step and the way in which the Jans's brothers, right, exploited Native American populations. You can learn about even UCLA's history. That's okay. It's okay to have that conversation. Explore your workplace's history. Explore the history of your corporation and find out, was your organization engaged in activities that may have caused harm to certain communities? You can also reject deficit thinking and embrace a growth mindset, as well as take action by using inclusive language. You heard Gloria at the top of this segment talk about the land acknowledgement, acknowledging the Tongva and Gabrielino peoples. I also acknowledge the Chumash, right? And other communities who are native to this land, who were also displaced from settlers who moved to this community that we now call Los Angeles, including the Tataviam. Those were original stewards of this land. Find ways to use inclusive language and partner with people in these communities so that we can close racial disparities. If you're in an organization and you're a manager, I want you to think about how you provide adequate funds and salary for these people, for people who do this work, as well as time off for all your team members. Think about the training and orientation that you have as an organization to help support folks' ability to build capacity internally. You heard about developing employee resource groups. You may have heard about other strategies internally, but plan for your staff's psychological safety. Provide access to medical and mental health supports, as well as supports for families who are having children who are dealing with maybe family relocation or even separation issues. Maybe the people who are doing this work, or some of your colleagues, have family that are dealing with other things outside of this space that is worth considering. Because we bring our whole selves to work, whether or not you realize it. Think about your organizational culture and the roles that you assign to people. Do you make this work just the work of that DEI person? Are they the ones, anytime an issue with race comes up, you just go right to them? Or is it the work of everybody on staff? Because no one person can solve racism by themselves, or homophobia, or any other ism, sexism by themselves. They can't do it. It is a collective responsibility of everyone in the organization. And you can allow time, if you're a manager, and space for people to have these conversations within the workplace, and provide training and support so they can build competencies as well. And then finally, understand the psychological and spiritual impact of this work. It takes a lot out of people to do it. And be a good example. If you are the boss who's in the office to 10 o'clock at night, responding to everybody's emails all the time, you are setting an example for your staff to follow. So when your staff is burned out, don't be surprised, because you're the example of burnout. If you can't take a break, what makes you think they're going to take a break? They see your example. They're going to feel like they have to be on work all the time. Look, I'm guilty of that. I've done that all the time with my staff. I'd be in there at 6 a.m. and wouldn't leave to 10. And they would feel guilty when they would leave at 6. I had to actively change that culture. right? Those are some of the things that we got to consider, as well as not only expressing general concern for the well-being of our staff members, but ensuring that when there are times of crisis, when you really need them, we provide the supports that people need to be well in their workplace as well. And finally, folks, praise each other, stay positive, lift each other up, as some of our team alumni are oft to hear me say, right? Where possible, find ways to invest in each other. So, I just want you all to know that things like racial trauma, right? Vicarious trauma, the stress that comes from doing this work is real. People don't just make it up. This is a reality that a lot of our folk and families face. And when someone is saying, I'm really stressed, they're telling you the truth. So hear them out. If you're an individual doing this work, plan for self-care. Find ways to manage your time and avoid compassion fatigue. Find ways to get some exercise in. I'm guilty of that. I don't prioritize my physical activity as much as I need to, because I feel like I'm always needing to work. We all have opportunities to improve. You can engage in mindfulness. You can be good to yourself. You can assert the time you need. You can find ways to reduce your stress by coping. There are some resources. If you see down here at the bottom right, if you can go to socialwork.buffalo.edu, there's a self-care starter kit that will give you some tips on how to do this work. But meditation and mindfulness are really powerful strategies. Being in green space, sleeping and eating well, these are all good ways that you can engage in caring for yourself and managing your emotional, spiritual, mental, social sort of well-being. I want to thank you all so much for the time that you've allowed me to share with you today. And want to invite you again to care for yourselves, to continue to lift up the people that are doing this work, and to build the emotional capacity we need to strengthen racial equity at work. Thank you again. And Gloria, I turn it back over to you.
Wow, thank you so much, D'Artagnan. That was, you continue to inspire all of us. Thank you for your hard work, especially for the County of Los Angeles. I know it's not easy work, but thank you for all that you do to not only lead us in Los Angeles County, but our Alumni Association as well, and for setting an example for all of us. So thank you for being the change maker that you are. So thank you, everyone. And I also wanted to lift up Dart because he is in the middle of also teaching alongside doing this keynote. And so he is definitely a social justice warrior for sure, because he's not only doing the work here, but also training future leaders as well and doing all of that hard work there. So thank you, D'Artagnan, for all of your hard work and leadership. I want to invite my colleague Patricia too. I know that we want to be able to, again, this is a Saturday. So thank you everyone for being here on a Saturday, taking time to learn, hopefully caring for yourself by listening to others as well. You are not alone in this DEI work. So many of us are also moving through spaces, processes, bureaucracy, but also making connections in our work and also outside of it. And so in this closing, we wanted to say thank you to Dart. And Patricia, did you want to say anything before we close out?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure, as Dart says, uplift all the folks that made this weekend possible. So, of course, to my colleague from the career engagement side, Gloria Ko, to the co-chairs of the Diversity Advisory Committee, Paco Ratana and Carlos Collard, to our career advisory committee, Ann Wang and Kathy Choi, of course, our president, who you just heard from, D'Artagnan Scorza, and all the various board members. There's so many of you that helped us kick off so many of these sessions. And we just really appreciate this. This has been a collaborative effort. And for those that don't know, our board are volunteers. So they worked in tandem and collaboration with the staff, which brings me to my next part. To our fierce leader, Associate Vice Chancellor Julie Sina, for making the space and the resources for us to do this. And then the most special thanks to the team. And if we can, I would love to spotlight them. And I would love if y'all, the vibes of snaps, I know we're not in the same room together, but to our teams that created this space, Claudia, who helped us with business development, Gerald and Christian and Corey, who helped us really moderate these panels, Gonzalo, who helped us with our website, and to our fearless project manager, Sandy Nguyen. Those are some of the main folks and faces that have been behind this 2-day summit. In addition to all our speakers and panelists, I am completely amazed that we were able to pull off this summit, maybe not like other schools, that the whole full roster were Bruins, and Bruins that were willing to say yes at a LinkedIn message or a Facebook message so quickly without any hesitation. I really want to thank all those that are doing this space, that joined us for these 2 days. I do want to really uplift what Dart said. You know, our happiness is a shared meaning. And I hope this weekend allowed us to build a shared meaning of understanding how we all can be anti-racist, and also to lift up what he said, to really find a community of support. I hope you all made so many connections this weekend. I know I have, some for the first time, some long-standing, but that's the way alumni work. We're here together, and we're here doing the work that we need to do to make all our lives better. I do want to hold space for one part of emotional labor that I really want to pronounce. We heard so many things this weekend coming from, you know, knowing that this work is personal and the work is professional and they're interchangeable. To note that this is the skill set that uses of the heart, the mind, the gut, and the soul, that you all are holding space for others, especially for those that are in the margins and marginalized. You listen deeply and you care deeply, and you do it in love. You value others, you see others, and you care for others. Clementine Morgan says something that I really wanted to lift up. For those that do emotional labor frequently, we can be very good at it without having ever articulated it. And no one will ever know that we're actually doing it. It's only when we don't do it that things start to fall apart. And then we begin to notice that work is completely essential. So just know that you are essential to your workplaces, you're essential to your local communities, you're essential to your communities, and you're essential to us. And so with that, you know, hopefully this summit has been just an ode to you, our change makers, a deep token of appreciation for all the work you do and uplift. We know we've been doing this and we'll continue to do this, and hopefully we can do this all together. So thank you so much for being with us these past 2 days, and we know we'll thank you in advance for all the work that you'll be doing moving forward.
And so thank you, everyone. That concludes our summit. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday and your weekend. Thank you for being here, and go Bruins.